The old man's weathered hands trembled as he reached slowly into his coat pocket. What emerged looked more like discarded junk than a symbol of valor, a tarnished, corroded piece of metal, so worn and faded that its original shape was barely recognizable. Military officials standing at attention exchanged subtle but unmistakable glances of disgust. Who was this stranger, this forgotten face, daring to bring what looked like scrap metal into the sacred ceremony of a decorated three-star general? The chapel seemed to hold its breath. The old man shuffled forward, his footsteps resonating against the cold marble floors, flanked by rows of American flags and wreaths sent by world leaders. Hundreds of eyes followed him, their gazes fixed on the gleaming casket draped in pristine stars and stripes, adorned with medals that caught the stained glass light like sparkling jewels. The contrast between the glittering honors and the rusted piece in his hand was stark and jarring. Then, with quiet determination, he did the unthinkable. He placed that rusty, worthless-looking object right beside the general's Congressional Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration. The room gasped. The audacity of the act was breathtaking, the perceived disrespect almost unbearable. Whispers rippled through the crowd, questioning his right, his intentions, his honor. But what happened next would shatter every assumption. What unfolded would reveal a profound story of loyalty, friendship, and promises forged in the darkest hours of war, a story that would forever redefine what it truly means to honor a soldier. Welcome to the Veteran Voices. Before we continue with this deeply moving story, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. If you believe stories of true brotherhood and sacrifice deserve to be heard, please hit that subscribe button to support our growing community. We're honored to share these moments with you, and your support means everything as we continue bringing these powerful human stories to light. The morning of General William Harrison's funeral dawned gray and solemn over Arlington National Cemetery. Mist clung to the rolling hills dotted with white headstones, each one marking a life given in service to country. The chapel, normally reserved for the most distinguished military funerals, buzzed with quiet activity as staff made final preparations for what would be one of the largest military ceremonies of the year. General Harrison hadn't just been any officer. His 43-year career had spanned 3 wars, countless classified operations, and a journey from second lieutenant to three-star general that read like a textbook on military excellence. His chest had carried more ribbons than most soldiers ever see, his walls more commendations than most units collectively earn. He'd advised presidents, commanded divisions, and shaped policy that affected military families across generations. The guest list reflected his extraordinary reach. 4-star generals flew in from active commands around the world. Former defense secretaries cleared their schedules. Congressional leaders, foreign military attaches, and diplomats filled pews normally occupied by grieving families. The honor guard consisted of representatives from every branch of service, each uniform pressed to perfection, each medal polished to mirror brightness. Outside, a full military band rehearsed the haunting notes of taps while ceremonial cannons were positioned for the traditional 21-gun salute. Inside the chapel, the general's casket rested on a pedestal draped in the finest American silk. The flag covering it had been folded and refolded until every stripe aligned perfectly, every star positioned with mathematical precision. Atop the casket, his medals were displayed in order of precedence, the Congressional Medal of Honor gleaming gold and blue, the silver star catching light like a beacon, bronze stars arranged in perfect formation, and ribbons representing conflicts from Vietnam to Afghanistan. Each decoration told a story of courage, leadership, and sacrifice that had earned him a place among America's most revered military leaders. But for all the pageantry, something felt incomplete. General Harrison's aide-de-camp, Colonel Martinez, stood at attention near the casket, his practiced eyes scanning the crowd. He'd served under the general for 8 years, had organized countless ceremonies, and knew better than anyone how these events should unfold. Yet something nagged at him, a sense that despite all the preparation, all the protocol, something essential was missing. The general had always been a man of deep relationships, someone who remembered every soldier who'd served under him, every family who'd sacrificed alongside their military member. But today, looking at the sea of brass and dignitaries, Martinez wondered if they'd forgotten to honor the human connections that had defined the general's true legacy. The service began with military precision. Chaplains delivered readings that spoke of duty, honor, and eternal rest. Speakers took the podium in order of rank, each offering carefully crafted eulogies that highlighted different aspects of the general's distinguished career. They spoke of strategic brilliance in the Gulf War, of compassionate leadership during humanitarian missions, of the countless young officers he'd mentored throughout his decades of service. The words were beautiful, appropriate, and somehow incomplete. They captured the general's professional achievements but missed something deeper, the personal bonds he'd forged with soldiers whose names would never appear in history books, whose stories would never make headlines, but whose lives he'd touched in ways that statistics could never measure. As the final eulogy concluded and the chapel prepared for the ceremonial honors, a movement near the back of the room caught Colonel Martinez's attention. An elderly man, probably in his 70s, was slowly making his way down the center aisle. He walked with the careful deliberation of someone whose body had been tested by time and hard living, but whose spirit remained unbroken. His clothes were clean but clearly not expensive, a simple dark suit that had seen better decades, shoes that were polished but worn, a white shirt with a collar that suggested it had been pressed by hand rather than professional cleaners. What struck Martinez wasn't the man's modest appearance, but the way he moved. Despite his age, despite the obvious difficulty each step presented, he carried himself with unmistakable military bearing. His back was straight, his shoulders squared, his eyes focused forward with the kind of purposeful determination that only comes from years of military training. This wasn't some confused elderly gentleman who'd wandered into the wrong ceremony. This was a soldier, and he was here with intention. The distinguished guests began to notice the intrusion. Whispers rippled through the front rows as generals and dignitaries turned to see who was disrupting the solemn proceedings. Some frowned with obvious irritation. This was a carefully choreographed ceremony, not a public memorial where anyone could simply walk up to pay respects. Security personnel positioned throughout the chapel tensed, hands moving subtly toward their radios, waiting for orders on how to handle this breach of protocol. But the old man seemed oblivious to the attention he was drawing. His focus remained entirely on the casket ahead, on the friend whose passing had brought him here despite what must have been considerable effort. As he drew closer, Martinez could see his face more clearly, deeply lined with age and weather, marked by experiences that had carved themselves into his features over decades. His eyes held a mixture of grief and determination, the look of someone who'd traveled a long distance, both physically and emotionally, to be in this moment. When he reached the front of the chapel, the elderly man paused. The entire room had fallen silent, hundreds of people watching to see what would happen next. Military protocol had no provision for this situation. The honor guard remained at attention, trained to maintain their positions regardless of circumstances, but their eyes tracked his movement with professional wariness. The chaplain, uncertain whether to intervene, glanced toward the ranking officers for guidance that didn't come. Then the old man did something that made several high-ranking officials audibly gasp. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew what appeared to be a piece of junk, a medal so tarnished and corroded it was barely recognizable as military decoration. The medal had turned dark with age, the ribbon was faded to the point where its original colors could only be guessed at, and the entire piece looked like something that had been stored in a garage for decades without care or attention. Colonel Martinez felt his stomach clench with second-hand embarrassment. Here, in the presence of some of the most distinguished military leaders in the country, surrounded by gleaming medals and pristine honors, this stranger was about to place what looked like corroded trash next to the General's Medal of Honor. The disrespect was staggering. Several officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and Martinez could see hands reaching for phones, preparing to document what they clearly viewed as an outrageous breach of funeral etiquette. A brigadier general seated in the front row leaned toward his aide and whispered harshly, "Who is this man? How did he get in here?" The aide shrugged helplessly, equally bewildered by the situation unfolding before them. Behind them, a defense contractor who'd worked with General Harrison on procurement deals shook his head in disgust, muttering under his breath about the decline of respect for military traditions. But the elderly man seemed entirely unaware of the shock and disapproval surrounding him. With hands that shook slightly from age or emotion, he gently placed the tarnished medal on the casket, right next to the General's Congressional Medal of Honor. The contrast was stark and, to many observers, deeply inappropriate, pristine gold and blue next to what looked like oxidized scrap metal, ceremonial perfection beside apparent neglect. For a moment that stretched like an eternity, nobody moved. The old man stood with his head bowed, lips moving in what might have been a prayer or final words meant only for his departed friend. The chapel remained frozen in a tableau of confusion and growing outrage, hundreds of people unsure whether they were witnessing a touching tribute or an unconscious act of disrespect. Then Colonel Martinez saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. Despite the corrosion, Despite the decades of tarnish that had obscured its details, he recognized the shape of the medal. More than that, he recognized its significance. As the general's aide-de-camp, he'd spent countless hours organizing the general's papers, reviewing his service record, cataloging his decorations and commendations. He knew every medal the general had ever been awarded, every honor he'd received, and every decoration he'd presented to others. What the old man had placed on the casket wasn't junk. It was a silver star, one of America's highest military decorations for valor in combat. But more than that, Martinez suddenly understood why it looked so familiar. He'd seen references to this specific medal in the general's personal files, had read the citation that accompanied its presentation, had wondered for years about the story behind one particular entry in the general's service record. Attention! Martinez's voice rang out across the chapel with commanding authority that cut through the confused murmurs like a blade. Every military person in the room instantly snapped to attention, years of training overriding their confusion. Civilians, unsure what was happening but recognizing the gravity in the colonel's voice, rose to their feet as well. Martinez stepped forward, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent chapel. "Ladies and gentlemen, you are in the presence of Master Sergeant James Mitchell, United States Army, retired. The medal he has just placed on General Harrison's casket is not refuse or junk. It is a silver star for gallantry in action, presented to Sergeant Mitchell by then-Lieutenant Harrison in 1974 during combat operations in Southeast Asia." The colonel's words hit the room like a physical force. Heads turned toward the elderly man with new understanding, new respect, new awareness of what they were witnessing. But Martinez wasn't finished. He'd spent years reading the general's files, and he knew the rest of the story, the part that would explain not just the medal's significance, but why this moment represented something far more profound than anyone in the room had initially understood. 50 years ago, Martinez continued, his voice heavy with emotion, after Sergeant Mitchell saved his life and the lives of 12 other soldiers by single-handedly holding off an enemy assault, Lieutenant Harrison presented him with this silver star. But as he pinned the medal to Sergeant Mitchell's uniform, the lieutenant made an unusual request. He asked the sergeant to keep the medal safe, to hold onto it until the day came when the lieutenant no longer needed his service. He said, "You keep this until I don't need it anymore." The chapel was so quiet that the sound of the old man's breathing seemed amplified. Tears were beginning to flow down cheeks throughout the room as the full weight of what they were witnessing began to sink in. This wasn't disrespect. This wasn't an intrusion. This was the fulfillment of a promise made between soldiers 50 years ago, a bond that had transcended time, distance, and the differences in their post-military lives. Martinez's voice broke slightly as he concluded, "Master Sergeant Mitchell has kept his word for half a century. Today, he returns this medal to his friend, his leader, and his brother in arms, because General Harrison's service is finally complete." In that moment, something extraordinary happened. Without any command or coordination, every person in the chapel, generals and privates, politicians and civilians, foreign dignitaries and Gold Star families, rose to their feet in a spontaneous gesture of respect. It wasn't the program standing that comes with military ceremony. It was an organic response to witnessing something sacred, something that spoke to the deepest truths about loyalty, friendship, and the bonds that tie soldiers together across decades and circumstance. The old sergeant, Master Sergeant Mitchell, slowly lifted his head and looked around the chapel. For the first time since entering, he seemed to register the hundreds of people surrounding him. His weathered face showed surprise at the attention, but also a quiet dignity that suggested he understood, perhaps better than anyone, what this moment meant. He wasn't here for recognition or applause. He was here to keep a promise, to honor a friendship, and to ensure that his friend's final journey was marked by the return of something that had symbolized their bond for 50 years. Colonel Martinez stepped closer to the casket and, in a voice that carried to every corner of the chapel, began to read from a citation he'd pulled from his jacket pocket, a document he'd carried to every ceremony involving the general, waiting for the right moment to share its contents. "The President of the United States takes pleasure in presenting the Silver Star to Sergeant James Mitchell, United States Army, for gallantry in action on April 15, 1974. When his unit came under intense enemy fire and his platoon leader was wounded, Sergeant Mitchell voluntarily exposed himself to hostile fire to drag Lieutenant Harrison to safety. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, Sergeant Mitchell maintained his position for over 3 hours, repelling multiple enemy assaults and enabling the evacuation of wounded personnel. His extraordinary heroism and devotion to duty were in keeping with the highest traditions of military service and reflect great credit upon himself, his unit, and the United States Army. As the citation was read, a fuller picture began to emerge for those in attendance. This wasn't just a story about a medal being returned. It was a story about two young soldiers whose lives had become intertwined in a moment of crisis, whose bond had been forged in combat and strengthened by mutual respect and admiration. Lieutenant Harrison had gone on to achieve great things in his military career, but he'd never forgotten the sergeant who'd saved his life when it mattered most. And Sergeant Mitchell had carried that medal, that symbol of their shared experience, for 50 years, waiting for this day when he could return it to his friend one final time. The military band, understanding without instruction that this moment called for something special, began to play taps. But this wasn't the ceremonial version played at every military funeral. This was slower, more mournful, played with the kind of emotion that comes from musicians who understood they were providing the soundtrack to something extraordinary. Each note seemed to hang in the air longer than usual, each phrase carrying the weight of 5 decades of friendship, loyalty, and mutual respect. As the haunting melody filled the chapel, Master Sergeant Mitchell performed one final act that brought tears to eyes throughout the room. With movements made careful by age but still precise with military training, he came to attention and rendered a slow, deliberate salute to his fallen friend. It wasn't the sharp, crisp salute of a young soldier. It was the salute of a man who'd carried the memory of shared danger, shared sacrifice, and shared brotherhood for 50 years. His hand trembled slightly as he held the position, but his back remained straight, his eyes remained forward, and his gesture remained unmistakably that of one soldier honoring another. The salute seemed to last forever, and perhaps it should have. In that frozen moment, with hundreds of people standing in respectful silence, with the tarnished silver star resting next to the General's Medal of Honor, with the notes of taps echoing off marble walls lined with the flags of a grateful nation, everyone present understood they were witnessing something that transcended ordinary funeral ceremony. They were seeing the visible manifestation of bonds that exist between those who've served together, sacrificed together, and trusted each other with their lives. When Master Sergeant Mitchell finally lowered his salute, he stepped back from the casket and began his slow walk back down the aisle. But this time, his journey was different. This time, as he passed each row, people reached out to touch his shoulder, to shake his hand, to offer words of thanks and respect. Generals who'd commanded thousands of troops stepped into the aisle to personally thank a sergeant they'd never met but whose story they now understood. Foreign military attaches, despite language barriers, offered gestures of respect that transcended words. Civilians who'd never served but who recognized courage when they saw it waited their turn to acknowledge a man who'd kept a promise for half a century. The formal ceremony continued after Master Sergeant Mitchell's departure, but everyone present knew they'd already witnessed the day's most important moment. The remaining eulogies, while well-intentioned and professionally delivered, felt somehow secondary to what had just occurred. The military honors, while executed with precision and dignity, couldn't match the simple power of an old soldier returning a tarnished medal to his friend. As the service concluded and guests began to file out of the chapel, conversations buzzed with discussions of what they'd witnessed. Military officers who'd attended dozens of funerals said they'd never seen anything like it. Civilian dignitaries struggled to find words for the emotion they'd experienced. But perhaps most telling were the reactions of the younger soldiers present, lieutenants and sergeants early in their careers who'd just seen a living example of the bonds they were forming with their own comrades. The promises they were making without fully understanding their long-term significance. Colonel Martinez, his duties as aide-de-camp nearly complete, made one final entry in the General's service record. Next to the notation about the Silver Star presentation in 1974, he added a simple line, "Medal returned by MSGT Mitchell, 2024. Promise kept." It was a small addition to an extensive file, but Martinez knew it captured something essential about the man they'd honored that day, not just his professional achievements or his strategic brilliance, but his ability to inspire the kind of loyalty that lasts a lifetime. Outside the chapel, Master Sergeant Mitchell walked slowly toward the parking lot where a simple sedan waited, probably the same car that had carried him to the funeral. The same vehicle that would take him back to whatever quiet life he'd built in the years since his military service ended. He moved with the same careful deliberation he'd shown entering the chapel, but now his mission was complete. The medal he'd carried for 50 years had been returned. The promise he'd made to a young lieutenant in 1974 had been fulfilled. His friend's service was finished, and so was his own obligation. A few people followed him outside, hoping for interviews or additional details about his story. But Master Sergeant Mitchell politely declined their requests, explaining simply that he'd said everything he needed to say inside the chapel. His actions had spoken louder than any words could, and he seemed to understand that sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones told through gestures rather than explanations. As his car pulled away from Arlington National Cemetery, those who remained behind continued to process what they'd witnessed. The tarnished silver star remained on General Harrison's casket, where it would accompany him to his final resting place. But its significance would live on in the memories of everyone who'd seen it returned, everyone who'd witnessed the fulfillment of a 50-year-old promise, everyone who'd been reminded that the deepest military traditions aren't found in regulation manuals or ceremony scripts, but in the bonds between those who've served together. The story of Master Sergeant Mitchell and General Harrison would be retold in military academies and officer training programs, passed down as an example of the kind of loyalty and brotherhood that defines military service at its best. Young soldiers would hear about the sergeant who kept a medal for 50 years, waiting for the right moment to return it. They'd learn about the lieutenant who grew up to become a general but never forgot the man who'd saved his life. And they'd understand, perhaps for the first time, that military service isn't just about individual achievement or personal advancement, but about the relationships that sustain soldiers through their darkest moments and continue to honor them long after their service has ended. In the days following the funeral, several news outlets picked up the story of the returned Silver Star. Military blogs and veteran websites shared the account of Master Sergeant Mitchell's promise and its fulfillment. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from other veterans who shared their own stories of bonds forged in service, promises made in difficult circumstances, and gestures of loyalty that had sustained them through decades of civilian life. One retired Marine wrote about a compass he'd carried for 30 years, given to him by a sergeant who'd said it would always point him toward home. A former Air Force pilot described a pair of wings he'd kept in his wallet, presented by an instructor who'd helped him through flight training. An Army medic told of a stethoscope she'd preserved since her deployment days, a gift from a doctor who'd taught her to save lives under fire. Each story was different in its details, but all shared the same theme: the power of physical objects to represent emotional bonds, the importance of keeping promises made in service, and the way that military friendships transcend time and circumstance. The rusty silver star that had seemed so inappropriate in the gleaming chapel had revealed itself to be worth more than all the pristine decorations surrounding it. Not because of its monetary value or its official significance, but because of what it represented: a promise kept, a friendship honored, and a demonstration that the deepest military traditions aren't always the ones that make it into official ceremonies. Sometimes, the most powerful tribute comes not from those who deliver prepared eulogies or perform ceremonial duties, but from those who simply show up when it matters most. Master Sergeant Mitchell had traveled whatever distance necessary, overcome whatever obstacles stood in his way, and fulfilled a 50-year-old obligation because that's what soldiers do for each other. They keep their promises. They honor their bonds. They remember their brothers and sisters in arms, not just during the good times, but especially during the moments when remembrance matters most. General Harrison's funeral had been planned as a celebration of his professional achievements and military legacy. But thanks to an elderly sergeant with a tarnished medal and an unbreakable promise, it became something more: a reminder that the greatest military traditions aren't found in regulations or protocols, but in the human connections that sustain those who serve. The ceremony had honored a distinguished general, but it had also revealed the character of a faithful friend. And in doing so, it had shown everyone present what military brotherhood really means. This story was brought to you by the Veteran Voices. As we reflect on Master Sergeant Mitchell's 50-year promise and General Harrison's enduring legacy, we want to ask you something personal. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Perhaps it was a teacher who believed in you when no one else did, a neighbor who helped your family through difficult times, or a friend who kept their word no matter what it cost them. These are the people who shape our lives in ways that can't be measured, who demonstrate through their actions what true loyalty and friendship look like. Tell us in the comments about someone who made a difference in your life through their quiet faithfulness, their kept promises, or their unwavering support. Share their stories so others can be inspired by the kind of character that changes the world one relationship at a time. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, please hit that subscribe button to support our channel as we continue sharing these powerful reminders of what makes humanity extraordinary. We'll see you in the next story. where we'll continue exploring the moments that reveal the very best of the human spirit.